Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into a paradox that is really dominating the global economic headlines right now. It's a phenomenon that has basically rewritten the playbook for international trade and, political leverage in less than a year.
It's more than a paradox. It's outright economic defiance. I mean, if you had told any trade analyst at the start of 2025 what the world would look like, with escalating U.S. tariffs, sanctions, all this uncertainty, they would have predicted a huge contraction for China.
Exactly. But in 2025, a year that was defined by that trade pressure, that intense geopolitical maneuvering, and this whole saga of de-risking supply chains, one country didn't just survive, it thrived to a degree we've never seen before. We're talking about China, which just reported the largest trade surplus the world has ever seen.
It is a staggering figure, and it's one that forces a complete rethink of how effective, unilateral trade pressure can actually be against a global manufacturing titan like that. The source material we have today really lays out the complex architecture of how they did this, and it also points to the geopolitical storm that this success is kicking off.
Right, especially with these new aggressive tariff threats coming from the U.S. administration. So our mission today is to go beyond that big headline. We need to understand not just the sheer size of the numbers, though they are historic, but what do these figures tell you, the learner? What do they reveal about supply chain resilience, the limits of trade policy, and, what happens when the world's second largest economy just decides to build a much wider moat around itself?
We have to start with the baseline number because the scale is just historic. The headline figure is that China reported a total trade surplus, that's goods and services sold overseas, versus what it buys of $1.19 trillion. Most people are just rounding it up to $1.2 trillion for 2025.
$1.2 trillion. I mean, to put that in perspective for everyone, that single-year surplus is larger than the entire GDP of most industrialized nations. We're talking countries like Spain or Australia. It is a colossal amount of net wealth being pulled in from the rest of the world.
It absolutely is. And this figure, it didn't just cross the trillion-dollar mark for the first time ever. It shattered what a lot of economists thought was a kind of natural ceiling. It just blew past the previous record from 2024, which was, at the time, a shocking $993 billion. So this isn't, marginal growth. This is accelerating, record-smashing performance under fire.
And that context from the Vice Minister of China's Customs Administration really set the stage. They came out and said these figures are extraordinary and hard-won, which tells you that Beijing sees this as a strategic victory, right? Not just some natural economic outcome. They fought for this.
They absolutely did. They acknowledged it was achieved against a backdrop of profound changes and huge challenges. It's them planting a flag.
Okay, so let's dig into these stunning numbers. This $1.2 trillion paradox.
Let's do it. And to really get it, you have to look at it on a monthly basis. When we say $1.19 trillion for the year, we're talking about an economy that was generating, on average, $100 billion of net sales almost every single month.
And that consistency is what was so, I think, disturbing for analysts in the West, according to the sources. China's monthly surpluses went over $100 billion 7 times in 2025. You have to compare that to 2024, when it only happened once.
Right. It shows this sustained, aggressive exporting power that wasn't just a blip. It was happening regardless of the political noise and the tariff threats from the U.S.
So what was the total trade picture?
Well, the total foreign trade in goods was about $6.51 trillion, up about 3.8% overall. But the gap, the place where this whole story lives, is between exports and imports. Total exports grew a really robust 6.1% for the year. Meanwhile, imports, they barely moved. They grew by a meager 0.5%.
Wow.
And that enormous accelerating gap, that is your $1.2 trillion surplus in concrete terms.
And this all happened during a massive trade war. We have to revisit that 2025 context because the tension was designed to be, almost existential. You remember April 2025, President Trump announced these sweeping tariffs on goods from over 90 countries. But China was, without a doubt, the main target.
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't just policy. The rhetoric amplified it. The sources detail this escalating war of words with very public threats of blanket triple-digit tariffs. We're talking 100% tariffs or even more on almost all Chinese goods.
And the thinking at the time from trade experts was that this was a test of China's reliance on the U.S. market.
Exactly. The economic hypothesis was pretty simple. If you block their main pipeline, the massive U.S. consumer market, the whole Chinese manufacturing system should seize up and force Beijing to the negotiating table.
But those most extreme threats, the triple-digit ones, they were avoided. There was that temporary truce agreed in South Korea between Trump and Xi in October. But the tariffs that are still in place are incredibly high.
They are. The sources are clear on this. Even after that truce, the U.S. tariff rate on most Chinese goods is still around 47.5%. And we need to pause and really understand what that number means in the real world for someone managing a supply chain.
Okay, yeah, let's break that down. So if you're a U.S. company, you're importing a widget from China that costs you $100 at the factory. What does that 47.5% tariff do?
It means you immediately owe the U.S. government an extra $47.50 just to get that widget out of the port. So your $100 widget now costs you $147.50 before it even hits your warehouse.
Which for a lot of products, especially those high-volume, low-cost goods, that completely wipes out your profit margin.
It does more than that. For many, it means you're selling at a loss. The consensus among experts is that this rate is, by definition, too high for most Chinese exporters to stay profitable selling directly to the U.S. It's a massive economic wall.
So here's the core of the paradox. You have this 47.5% tariff wall designed to crush imports, yet China posts a record-breaking $1.2 trillion surplus. Did the tariffs even work at all?
Yes and no. And this is the critical point. They had a profound immediate effect on the bilateral relationship, just between China and the U.S. Chinese exports directly to the United States fell by a colossal 28% in 2025.
28%, that's a huge contraction.
A massive, sudden drop. So in that very narrow sense, the tariffs worked exactly as intended. They dramatically cut the volume of goods flowing directly from Chinese ports to American shelves.
Okay, so that's a catastrophic hit from your single biggest customer. That's the wound. The $1.2 trillion surplus means the rest of the global economy basically acted as their high-speed triage unit.
That's the perfect way to put it. The paradox is explained by simple math across the rest of the globe. That 28% loss to the U.S. was completely absorbed, replaced, and then surpassed by a huge strategic rise in Chinese exports everywhere else. They didn't shrink, they just pivoted. The rest of the world combined was bigger than the U.S. market alone.
So let's talk about that pivot, because this is the core of how they built this resilience. If they had a 28% hole to fill, where do all those billions in exports actually go?
The main engine was just robust, fast-paced trade with global partners besides the U.S. It seems to have been a very concerted effort by both the government and individual exporters to aggressively find new customers and deepen ties with markets that were less politically hostile.
And the sources are pretty specific about where this new demand came from. There's a huge range of regions, especially what we call emerging markets. We're talking Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America, and big moves into the Middle East. Europe was also a key destination for some of the higher value goods.
And the speed of it suggests it wasn't just a natural market drift. This was strategic. Think about Southeast Asia. As U.S. tariffs went up, Chinese parts and finished goods started flooding into places like Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia at record rates. And these are markets where China had already been investing heavily in things like infrastructure, which made the logistics of the pivot much easier.
Right. It minimizes vulnerability. The Vice Minister of China's Customs Administration even highlighted this. He said their trade partners are now more diversified, and the ability to resist risk has significantly increased. And that statement is basically the scorecard for Beijing. They did it. They've successfully reduced their reliance on any single market.
And that has huge implications for the future. If the U.S. threatens a 50% tariff now, the impact is softened because China has already built these robust markets in Riyadh, in Sao Paulo, in Jakarta. The leverage has shifted.
Okay, that makes sense. But a massive trade surplus, by definition, isn't just about selling a ton. It's also about not buying much yourself. Which brings us to the other key mechanic here. The weakness in their own domestic demand.
This is so critical. That $1.2 trillion surplus is actually a bit of a mixed blessing because it's not a sign of pure strength. Part of the reason for the record surplus is that China's own economy is, frankly, weak right now. It's being weighed down by a really deep, prolonged property crisis and these historically high debt levels.
Which means people get nervous. When you're worried about your property values or job security, you stop spending.
Exactly. Businesses get very hesitant to invest. Consumers become extremely cautious about buying anything that isn't essential. So the demand for imported goods, whether it's raw materials or finished products like cars or luxury items, it just dries up.
So the surplus, while it looks amazing on paper, is partly a reflection of a really sluggish domestic economy.
That's the painful part for Beijing. Just look at the numbers again. Exports grew 6.1%, which shows incredible external strength. but imports grew by a practically stagnant 0.5%. That tiny import growth tells you Chinese factories weren't gearing up for a big domestic sales boom. They were making everything for other countries.
It's like a factory running at full tilt, but instead of the product splitting between home and abroad, everything just gets shoved out the door onto a container ship.
And that can create its own problems, like deflationary pressure at home.
Yeah.
But for the trade balance, it's a perfect storm. They're essentially exporting their way out of a domestic slump.
But it wasn't just about selling more of the same old stuff to new places. There's also this technology edge. They've been strategically moving up the value chain for years.
And this is where the future of global competition really lies. The customs officials specifically pointed to a huge accelerated rise in exports of high-value goods.
Things like green tech.
Right. Exactly. Green technology is the big one. Solar panels, lithium batteries, and increasingly sophisticated electric vehicles. We also saw huge jumps in AI-related products and advanced robotics. It shows the export base isn't just cheap T-shirts anymore. They're competing and, in many sectors, dominating industries that are essential for the future. And that makes them incredibly hard to replace or sanction no matter what the political goals are.
So to sum this part up, they dodged the political risk by finding new customers, and the surplus got a massive boost because their own internal problems meant they weren't buying much from anyone else. It's a really complex mix of strength and weakness.
And then you layer on the strategic elements that made their goods so attractive in the first place, starting with the big one, the weak yuan.
Right. For anyone who isn't deep in currency markets, can you just explain how a weak currency helps create a $1.2 trillion surplus?
Sure. When a country's currency, like the yuan, weakens against others, like the dollar or the euro, it means foreign buyers need less of their own money to buy the Chinese product. So if the yuan is down 10% against the dollar, an American buyer basically gets an instant 10% discount, even if the Chinese factory doesn't change its own price at all.
It's like a massive, ongoing, system-wide sale on everything made in China.
That's a great way to put it. It's a huge subsidy. And you have to pair that with two other things that were happening globally. First, China just kept producing. Their supply chains were strong while others were struggling. Second, you had high inflation in the West. So goods made in the US or Europe were getting more expensive, while at the same time, the weak yuan was making Chinese goods cheaper. For a business, the choice was obvious.
So why does Beijing let the yuan stay weak? You'd think with a record surplus, they'd want a stronger currency.
It's a strategic choice, a deliberate one. If they let the yuan strengthen significantly, their exports would instantly become more expensive, and that could kill the very export growth that's helping them through their domestic slump. They're basically trading currency strength for export volume.
And it wasn't just currency. They were also doing some very clever supply chain restructuring to get around the tariffs.
This is probably the most ingenious part of the whole story. Instead of just giving up on products facing that 47.5% U.S. tariff, Chinese companies started shifting just the final assembly stages to other countries.
So like all the important high-value parts are still made in China, but the final product gets screwed together in, say, Vietnam or Mexico.
Exactly. Because of something called rules of origin. For U.S. tariff purposes, the country of origin is usually where the last substantial transformation happens. So if a Chinese component is shipped to Vietnam, assembled into a phone, and then shipped to the U.S., it might enter under Vietnam's much lower tariff rate.
That's a complete end run around the tariffs. The U.S. is effectively taxing a Vietnamese assembly line, but most of the value, the profits, the R&D, is still going back to China.
That is the whole mechanism. And it's what allowed Chinese production to remain essential to the world, even if it wasn't always shipping directly from a Chinese port to an American one.
And the sources suggest this isn't a one-off trick. It's a new structural reality for 2026.
That's the conclusion. One expert was quoted saying, "This means Chinese goods are now a global necessity." The idea is that the world is so deeply dependent on Chinese inputs that political barriers just force a rerouting. They don't stop the flow. We're seeing structural dependence in action.
Okay, so we've established the surplus is a mixed blessing inside China. But for the rest of the world, a surplus that big usually creates, well, a crisis.
It creates huge competitive pressure. While China gets the cash and the jobs, that success fuels a lot of trade friction everywhere else. Trade analysts are warning that Chinese goods could face greater scrutiny from other countries trying to protect their own industries.
And that's because of this flooding concern, right?
Exactly. China's massive volume, plus the price advantage from the weak yuan, means their products are often just overwhelmingly cheap. A domestic producer in the US or Germany simply can't compete on price. This leads directly to political pressure in those countries to put up their own tariffs, so-called anti-dumping duties, to level the playing field.
And we're seeing this play out with traditional exporters like the EU and Japan. The sources say they're losing market share.
They are. They're getting squeezed. They're caught between U.S. protectionism on one side and aggressive Chinese competition in third markets on the other. So they're losing ground on two fronts. Experts are saying these regions really need to figure out how to compete with the China challenge everywhere, not just in the U.S.
It sounds like a negative outcome for everyone but China. But there was a counter-argument in the sources, a perspective that says maybe we shouldn't worry so much.
Right, and that's the pure economic argument. It basically says that in many cases, Chinese goods aren't displacing local producers. They're just replacing less competitive imports from other, more expensive countries.
Okay, walk me through that.
So imagine a manufacturer in Brazil. Maybe they used to import a machine part from Germany for a premium. Now they can get a similar, reliable part from China for 25% less. The Brazilian company saves money, makes its own product cheaper, and becomes more competitive. In that case, China didn't displace a Brazilian firm, they displaced a German one.
And the benefit goes to Brazil, the importing country.
Precisely. The argument is that this might even help a country like Brazil reduce its own trade deficit with those other more expensive partners. It reframes China not as an aggressor, but as an efficiency provider for the whole global system.
That's a much harder argument to fight politically, even if the result is still painful for traditional manufacturing hubs.
It is. But local pain is what drives policy, which is why, despite the record numbers, the Chinese Customs Administration itself issued a warning.
They sound cautious, even in victory.
Very. They warned that China faces an uncertain external environment heading into 2026. They know the geopolitical landscape is only getting hotter and the tariff threats aren't going away. Businesses are bracing for another year of turbulence, especially from the U.S.
Which brings us to the latest development. A new front in this trade war, which is targeting something else entirely.
Exactly. Right as China announced this record surplus, we got this escalation event. The application of trade sanctions as a blunt foreign policy weapon.
This is the new threat from President Trump.
Yeah.
A plan to impose a huge 25% tariff on any country that trades with Iran.
And the context is purely political. It's meant as a punishment for Tehran's brutal crackdown on anti-government protests, where the death toll is reportedly over 2,400. It's using economic leverage for human rights goals.
The scope of it is what's really terrifying for global business. The president said the tariff would be effective immediately on any and all business being done with the United States.
And that wording is a radical departure. We need to be clear about this. Historically, U.S. secondary sanctions targeted specific companies or banks. You force a bank to choose between using the U.S. dollar or trading with Iran. It was precise.
So it targeted the financial plumbing.
It did. This new proposal threatens to target an entire country's trade relationship with the U.S. It's a blanket measure. If China trades with Iran, then every single Chinese product could face this massive new tariff. It's so much broader and more destructive.
And it puts China right in the crosshairs. They're Iran's biggest trading partner.
By a huge margin. They are Tehran's economic lifeline. Data shows China was buying 77% of Iran's oil exports in 2024. So if this 25% tariff gets implemented, it's another massive barrier on top of the 47.5% they already face.
And China's response was predictable.
Immediate and sharp. A spokesperson threatened retaliation, saying Beijing would take all necessary measures to safeguard its legitimate rights. Their philosophy remains the same. There are no winners in a tariff war. But this really raises the stakes.
And it's not just about China. This affects key U.S. allies, too.
Absolutely. The sources list India, the UAE, Japan, and South Korea. This creates a diplomatic crisis for U.S. allies who are now facing the same threats as their rivals.
You've got this double-hit scenario for Japan and South Korea. They just went through these brutal trade negotiations and ended up with a 15% tariff.
And now, if they keep trading with Iran, they could face this new 25% tariff on top of the existing ones. So a Japanese product facing a 15% tariff could suddenly jump to 40%. It makes them completely uncompetitive overnight.
It's just compounding the punishment. And it forces these countries to make an impossible choice.
Yeah.
Abandon a vital energy partner or lose access to the U.S. market.
Right, and hanging over all of this is a massive legal wild card. A situation that could undermine the entire tariff strategy.
The U.S. Supreme Court challenge.
We can't ignore it. The president's broad use of executive orders to impose tariffs is under serious legal pressure. The Supreme Court is considering whether to strike down a huge swath of these global tariffs.
Which would be a test of presidential power itself.
A huge one. And the consequences of a reversal would be, in Trump's own words, a complete mess. Because if the tariffs are ruled unconstitutional, then businesses and countries could legally claim refunds for all the duties they've paid for years.
Billions and billions of dollars.
Yeah.
And he said it would be almost impossible for our country to pay.
It's basically an admission that the whole system is built on a legally shaky foundation. So you have this high-stakes tension. Military options against Iran are on the table, but this tariff threat adds this immediate, powerful economic leverage, even as its own legal future is uncertain.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner, trying to make sense of this? From a $1.2 trillion surplus to a potential global tariff tsunami.
I think that there are two really profound interconnected lessons here.
The first is about the limits of tariffs. They can absolutely redirect trade. That 28% drop in U.S.-China trade proves it. But they don't automatically weaken a manufacturing giant like China. Their network is now too diversified, too essential, and too clever at routing around barriers to be contained by one country's policy.
And the second lesson is about U.S. policy. The administration is clearly comfortable using tariffs as this rapid response diplomatic tool, but these actions are creating global turbulence. They're complicating relationships with allies, and the whole strategy is facing this critical legal challenge at home. So the foundation of this key policy tool is unstable, even if the will to use it remains very strong.
It's a fascinating snapshot of a changing world where economic power is being wielded like military force, but the global economy keeps finding ways to adapt.
It is. We've seen China bypass this intense pressure through resilience and ingenuity, but that brings us to our final provocative thought for you to consider.
The $1.2 trillion surplus, as we've said, was supercharged by China's weak domestic demand. Imports were basically flat. So what happens next year if that domestic market finally recovers? What if Chinese consumers and businesses finally start spending again?
If that happens, their demand for imports, for cars, for energy, for luxury goods will soar. And that surge in purchasing power would automatically shrink China's trade surplus more effectively and more rapidly than any tariff campaign the U.S. could ever dream up. The paradox might just solve itself from the inside. The external political problem of China's trade strength could, in the end, be solved not by Washington, but by the pent-up spending power of the Chinese consumer. Something to mull over as you watch the markets in 2026.